What happened to a medieval woman who got pregnant without a husband? The answer will shock you to your core. This wasn't just about shame, it was about survival, brutal punishments, and desperate choices that could mean life or death. Imagine this, you're a 16-year-old girl in 1347. You've made one mistake, maybe with the blacksmith's son, maybe with a traveling merchant, maybe you were forced by someone more powerful. Now you're pregnant, and in a world where your purity is literally your only currency, you face a choice: hide it and risk everything, or face punishments so brutal they'd make modern people physically sick. From public humiliation to being buried alive, from secret monasteries to underground networks of women risking their lives to help each other, today we're diving into the dark reality that medieval society desperately tried to hide. We'll explore the shocking regional differences in punishment, the surprising role of the church, and the incredible ingenuity of medieval women who found ways to survive in an impossible world. By the end of this video, you'll understand why some historians call unmarried pregnancy the medieval death sentence, and why other historians argue it created some of the most sophisticated underground networks in European history. Let's start with why this was such a catastrophe. In our modern world, we might think, okay, unexpected pregnancy, it's difficult but manageable. But in medieval times, this was literally a threat to the entire social fabric. Here's what you need to understand: medieval society was built on what historians call honor economics. A woman's virginity wasn't just personal, it was a commodity. When a father arranged his daughter's marriage, he was essentially selling her guaranteed purity. Marriage contracts would literally specify that the bride was intact and pure. We have actual marriage contracts from 1200s France where the groom's family could demand their money back if the bride wasn't a virgin. In some German states, a woman's father could be sued for fraud if his daughter turned out to be damaged goods. So when a woman became pregnant outside marriage, she didn't just shame herself, she potentially bankrupted her entire family. But it gets worse. Her sisters couldn't marry well because the family's reputation was ruined. Her brothers might be rejected from guilds. Her father could lose business contracts. We're talking about economic devastation that could last generations. Now here's where it gets really complex, and this is something most people don't know. The punishment for unmarried pregnancy varied so wildly across medieval Europe that a woman could face death in one town and just a fine in the next town over. Let's take a journey across medieval Europe and see how differently this crime was treated. And I'm using air quotes because in some places, it wasn't even considered a crime. In Germanic regions, particularly around modern-day Germany and Austria, the punishments were absolutely brutal. We have records from Nuremberg showing that unmarried pregnant women could be sewn into sacks with a cat, a dog, a rooster, and a snake, then thrown into the river. The logic was that they had corrupted nature, so nature should reclaim them. But travel north to Scandinavia, and the picture changes dramatically. Norse law actually had provisions for unmarried mothers. They could claim a maiden's portion, essentially child support from the father. Some Swedish towns even had special houses for unmarried mothers, run by the community. In England, it depended heavily on whether you were in a city or the countryside. London had surprisingly lenient policies, maybe because it was a trade city and they needed workers. But rural England, that's where you'd face the pillory, public whipping, and being forced to wear the badge of shame. France was the most complex of all. In the north, influenced by Germanic law, punishments were severe. But in the south, closer to Roman law traditions, there were more options. Some French towns had houses of refuge where women could give birth anonymously and leave their babies with no questions asked. Italy had the most surprising approach. Because of the Catholic Church's influence, many Italian city-states focused on penance rather than punishment. Florence had an entire system for rehabilitating fallen women, though it involved years of unpaid labor in convents. So what did these desperate women actually do? Well, they got creative. And by creative, I mean they developed some of the most elaborate deception schemes in history. First, let's talk about hiding the pregnancy. This wasn't just wear loose clothes and hope for the best. Medieval women developed sophisticated techniques. They'd bind their stomachs with special corsets, not the fashionable kind, but tight, painful contraptions that could hide a pregnancy for months. They'd fake illnesses to explain weight gain and behavioral changes. Dropsy was a favorite. It caused swelling and explained why you couldn't do physical labor. Some women would claim to be possessed by demons to explain strange behavior and cravings. The herb networks. But hiding only worked for so long. When that failed, women turned to what historians call the herb networks. This was a sophisticated underground system of knowledge about plants that could terminate pregnancies. We're talking about pennyroyal, tansy, rue, savon, and dozens of other plants. But here's the horrifying part: these weren't just ineffective, they were deadly. Medieval medical texts show that for every pregnancy ended, multiple women died from poisoning, hemorrhaging, or organ failure. The women who distributed these herbs, called wise women or cunning women, were taking enormous risks. If caught, they could be accused of witchcraft and face burning at the stake. Yet they continued because they saw the desperation of their fellow women. For women who couldn't hide or terminate the pregnancy, the next option was secret birth and abandonment. This is where medieval women showed incredible ingenuity. They'd fake pilgrimages to distant shrines, actually traveling to places where they could give birth anonymously. Many monasteries had foundling wheels, rotating wooden cylinders where you could place a baby, ring a bell, and disappear before anyone saw you. Some Italian cities had elaborate systems where abandoned babies were automatically given surnames and raised by the state. But here's the heartbreaking reality: the survival rates for abandoned infants were horrific. In some regions, less than 10% of foundlings survived to adulthood. Women knew this, but they also knew that a 10% chance was better than the certain death that awaited both mother and child if they were discovered. Now, let's talk about the Catholic Church's role in all this. And this is where the story gets really complex, because the Church's official position and their actual practices were often completely different. Officially, the Catholic Church condemned premarital sex as a mortal sin. Church doctrine stated that unmarried pregnant women were vessels of corruption, who threatened the moral fabric of Christian society. The official punishment was public penance, exclusion from communion, and in severe cases, excommunication. But in practice, the Church was often the unmarried mother's best hope for survival. Why? Because unlike secular courts, church courts were more concerned with redemption than punishment. They believed that true penance could wash away any sin. Many monasteries developed sophisticated systems for helping pregnant women. They'd arrive as pilgrims seeking spiritual guidance, stay for months of prayer and contemplation, give birth in secret, and leave with their spiritual awakening complete. The Abbey of Fontevraud in France was famous for this. Records show hundreds of women arriving pregnant and leaving several months later, significantly thinner and with substantial donations to the abbey. Everyone involved maintained the fiction that these were spiritual retreats. Some nunneries specialized in what they called works of mercy. The Sisters of Magdalene in various European cities were known to take in pregnant women, deliver their babies, and arrange for adoption or care. They'd create elaborate stories about the women being penitent sinners seeking redemption. The Church's lenient approach wasn't just about mercy, it was about politics. They were competing with secular courts for authority. By offering forgiveness where secular law offered death, they positioned themselves as more compassionate and gained political power. But even within the Church, regional differences were enormous. Spanish monasteries, influenced by Islamic traditions of charity, were incredibly welcoming. English monasteries, influenced by Germanic law, were much harsher. Italian monasteries fell somewhere in between. Now we need to talk about what happened when women were caught and prosecuted. And I need to give you a content warning here: some of these punishments are genuinely disturbing and show just how brutal medieval justice could be. Medieval justice wasn't about rehabilitation or deterrence like modern justice. It was about cosmic balance. The belief was that sin created a literal imbalance in the universe, and only equivalent suffering could restore harmony. Let's start with the Germanic regions, where punishments were the most severe. In addition to the drowning I mentioned earlier, some German states practiced live burial. Women would be forced to dig their own graves, then buried up to their necks and left to die of exposure. The symbolism was deliberate. They believed that by having sex outside marriage, the woman had corrupted the earth, so the earth should reclaim her. The presence of animals in drowning sacks represented the bestial nature of her sin. More commonly, women faced elaborate public shaming rituals. In England, they'd be forced to appear in church wearing only a white sheet, holding a white rod, and publicly confessing their sin to the entire congregation. This could happen every Sunday for months. Many regions had their own version of the scarlet letter centuries before Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote about it. Women might be forced to wear red letters, for adultery, or special clothing that marked them as fallen women. In some German towns, they had to wear yellow veils that marked them as impure. The economic consequences were devastating and permanent. In most regions, fallen women couldn't inherit property, couldn't work in guilds, couldn't marry into respectable families. They were essentially sentenced to lifelong poverty. Here's something that will make you angry: the men involved faced minimal consequences. If they were married, they might pay a fine to the church. If they were unmarried, they often faced no punishment at all. Some regions even had laws stating that if a man could prove the woman seduced him, he was completely innocent. In some regions, the woman's entire family faced punishment. Parents could be fined, siblings could be banned from guild membership, and the family could be excluded from community events. This created enormous pressure on families to either hide the pregnancy or abandon the woman entirely. But here's where the story gets really fascinating. Medieval women didn't just accept these brutal systems, they fought back. And they created some of the most sophisticated underground networks in European history. At the center of these networks were midwives. These women had medical knowledge, community connections, and most importantly, they understood that women's lives were at stake. They developed elaborate systems for helping pregnant women hide, give birth safely, and find solutions. They used code words and signals that sound like something from a spy novel. A woman asking for special herbs for her garden might be requesting pregnancy-ending plants. A request for assistance with a difficult harvest could mean she needed help with a secret birth. These networks established safe houses, usually the homes of widows or older women who were beyond suspicion. These houses had hidden rooms, secret passages, and elaborate stories to explain why young women were visiting. The networks crossed regional boundaries. A woman in danger in one town could be passed along a chain of safe houses until she reached a region where she'd be safe. Some of these journeys covered hundreds of miles and involved dozens of conspirators. They developed sophisticated false identity systems. Women would be given fake names, fake histories, and fake documentation. Some networks even arranged fake marriages to men who were paid to participate in the deception. Surprisingly, many noble women were involved in these networks. They had the resources to help and the social protection to avoid consequences. Some queens and duchesses were known to secretly fund these operations. The women involved in these networks were taking incredible risks. If caught, they could face charges of conspiracy, witchcraft, or treason. Yet they continued because they saw the alternative, watching their sisters die for the crime of being human. Historians have compared these networks to the Underground Railroad in America or resistance networks in German-occupied Europe. They show the same patterns of ordinary people taking extraordinary risks to help others survive unjust systems. Despite all this darkness, there were surprising exceptions, situations where unmarried pregnancy didn't mean social death. If you were wealthy or noble, you had options. Rich families could arrange hasty marriages, claiming the couple had been secretly engaged. They could send daughters to distant relatives who didn't actually exist. They could even pay for fake husbands, men who would marry temporarily for money, then conveniently die in distant lands. Women in certain professions had more flexibility. Actresses, tavern workers, market vendors, and traveling merchants were already considered questionable by society. One more transgression didn't destroy them completely. Cities were generally more lenient than rural areas. In places like London, Paris, or Florence, where trade was more important than reputation, pregnant women could often disappear into the crowds and reinvent themselves. Interestingly, the Black Death created opportunities for unmarried mothers. With so many people dead, communities were desperate for workers and less concerned about moral purity. Some plague-devastated towns actively recruited women, regardless of their past. Some religious movements were more accepting. Certain mystical Christian sects believed that earthly sins were irrelevant compared to spiritual purity. These communities sometimes welcomed unmarried mothers as fellow sinners seeking redemption. So what happened to unmarried pregnant women in medieval times? The answer is, it depends entirely on where they lived, how much money they had, who they knew, and how clever they were at navigating an incredibly dangerous and inconsistent system. But here's what struck me most while researching this: for every brutal law, there were people trying to circumvent it. For every harsh punishment, there were networks trying to prevent it. For every woman who faced social death, there were other women risking their lives to help her. Medieval society was harsh, hypocritical, and often cruel, but it was also human. And humans, when faced with unjust systems, find ways to resist, to help each other, and to survive. What other dark secrets of medieval life should we explore? The hidden lives of medieval children? The shocking truth about medieval marriage? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more historical deep dives that reveal the complex truth behind the myths.